Welcome to Brain Wellness, the podcast. I'm your host, Mandi NP. What started as all things related to brain health and wellness has morphed into largely brain injury health and wellness, with occasional other neurological topics. My mission remains the same, to help you on the path to a healthier brain. So, without further ado, let's get into the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. This week, I have probably a little bit shorter episode, partly because, as many of you, I think, know, I added a fourth day of work, and it's hitting me hard. I'm not recovering quite as well from those days at work, and it takes me a little bit longer to process some of these things. So I have a couple week hiatus from having any guests signed up to be interviewed for the show, partly because I have a lot of presentations coming up in the next few weeks, and just wanted to get something out to you guys. And I had some big things happen recently. In the last couple of weeks, I kind of got a last minute invitation, to be a part of a speaking panel out in Washington, D.C. So I wanted to share some information with you on that trip and then talk a little bit about just policy in general as it relates to traumatic brain injury. So today is going to be our policy episode. So I'm going to share a little bit of information with you about, again, what I talked about at the Capitol and just some of the policies in general that we have here in the United States. And I realize that I have listeners from all over the globe at this point, and I would love to get input on how policies work in other countries. I have a little bit of information today that I'll talk about on a global level. So into the show we go. So to start off, again, I wanted to share a little bit of information about that trip that I had to Washington, D.C. So I am now a member of an organization called the Society for Brain Mapping and Therapeutics. I am going out to Los Angeles next week to present at the annual conference for said organization. And as part of that, I was invited to go along to be a member of the speaking panel on Brain Mapping Day out at Washington, D.C. This happened. Let me pull up my calendar because I'm drawing a blank on what day it was. This was back on March 26th that I did this. So when this is coming out here, it's been a couple weeks since I did this. So back on March 26th, I made a really quick turnaround, flew out to Washington, D.C. Wednesday night. We went to the Capitol on Thursday for Brain Mapping Day, and then I flew back to Minnesota again that night. So very fast turnaround, less than 24 hours spent in Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital. But it was a really, really exciting day. I met a lot of really good connections. Some of them might be listening to this episode because I introduced them to my show, as well as connecting with some of our legislators at the Capitol. They were in session, so we didn't get to speak with a lot of people, but we had a few really good members in attendance from both major parties, both Republican and Democratic representatives and senators. So it was a really good turnout for that perspective. And my take on it was just from being a provider and a patient and needing neurotechnology, neuro rehab methods to help me get better after my own brain injury. So it was Neurotech Day, right? All of us speakers, most in the group were MDs, PhDs. I was the only nurse practitioner in the group. That made me feel pretty cool for that. And we had a couple of patients who have used neurotechnology to improve and get better, came and shared their stories as well. And I have that unique perspective of having spent time on both sides of the stethoscope. I say that all the time, that I've been on both sides of the stethoscope. So I've been a patient with the TBI, and I've been the provider, and I am the provider of patients now that have TBI. And I refer many of my patients to the same neurotechnologies that helped me to get better. Brain Injury Myths Busted, Challenging Assumptions in Diagnosis and Treatment was the kind of the title that we had there. So for this 13th annual Brain Mapping Day. So I first initially shared just why this matters to me. Again, many of you have heard these stories before, but I've worked in neurosciences since 2000 to some degree. I started as a nursing assistant, then I was a nurse, and now a nurse practitioner. And in April of 2023, my life considerably changed from my motor vehicle accident. And it did take me almost 2 years to get back to work, even at part-time. And I didn't know my own symptoms at that point. I wasn't aware of all of the difficulties that I had with speech. I knew I had a headache, but I didn't really realize all the vision problems I had, the balance, the cognitive issues, the understanding what I read, heard, listened to, saw. All of these things were difficulties for me. And imaging didn't diagnose my concussion, my head injury. I went to a level 1 trauma facility, but they didn't even tell me I had a concussion. MRI, Ts did not do anything for diagnosing my brain injury, and the traditional therapy alone didn't help it. I did PTOT and worked with neurooptometry this first 6 months, and I really didn't see a significant change in my symptoms. So along that line of thought, kind of what we've always thought about concussion and brain injury is maybe we would do a CT or an MRI of the brain, but most of those, probably about 90+% of those images are normal, or they're listed as no acute intracranial findings. So often the patients are told that nothing's wrong because your brain imaging is normal, so therefore nothing can be wrong with you. And this can't be farther from the truth. Those images only identify if there's a bleed or if there's a skull fracture. It does not tell us if there is or is not a brain injury. And then we used to think that most people recovered in 3 to 4 weeks, and anything longer than that, the patients were malingering or making up their symptoms, essentially. And now we know, since 2021, all the research that's been out there has identified that 30 to 50% of individuals with brain injury continue to have symptoms greater than 1 year. So well beyond a year, they're still having symptoms. That is very different from that 3 to 4 weeks that we used to think. And then again, we used to say those traditional treatments, PTOT, speech, maybe neurooptometry, maybe. And do those treatments, you rest, and time will get you better. And again, now we know better. There are better diagnostics available now. Abbott and other companies outside the United States are developing brain blood biomarker evaluations to identify if somebody's had an acute head injury. What is this good for? It helps us to identify if somebody actually needs an image. Do they need a CT or an MRI? What's the likelihood that they might have had a head bleed? And those blood biomarkers peak within 12 to 24 hours after the injury. The problem with this is that it's not covered by all insurance. It's not used in all places. I know down in Florida is probably, when the last I talked to some of these companies, that was the biggest area that was using it. So not all places, even within the United States, have this available. And it's not going to be a clinic-based type of thing. This is going to be an emergency room when a patient is going in, that acute treatment to identify if they've had a brain injury. And SPECT scan, this is one that I've learned of more recently, again in the last couple of years. SPECT scan is something that actually can identify changes consistent in the brain with TBI. It doesn't tell you where you've had the brain injury or how many, but we can see consistent changes that follow a pattern that tell us if there's a brain injury that's been involved. Again, it's not readily available. This is not something that's available everywhere. The most places that I've heard of it is at the Amen clinics across the United States. And we do have a somewhat similar scan at our Mayo Clinic here in Minnesota, but as the only place that potentially can get that scan. And I've not seen those scans, so I don't know how it compares to the 3D version that you can get at the Amen clinics. And now there are better treatments available. So we used to think that 3 to 4 weeks, time alone, just rest, and then you're going to get better. But that's not how that works either for most patients. So all of these treatments, photobiomodulation, that's red light therapy, can be done in the form of a bed. It can be done in form of a laser. That's the transcranial laser treatments. Both of those are going to be done to try to decrease inflammation in the brain, to increase blood flow to the brain, to potentially create new blood vessels into the brain and increase the healing time or decrease the healing time, essentially. So we're increasing the speed of healing, and we're improving benefits with cognition, with headaches, with brain injury, and multiple other neurological diseases. EWOT and HBOT. EWOT is exercise with oxygen therapy. HBOT is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. EWOT you do on a bike, 92% oxygen. It takes about 15 minutes to do something similar in that you would do 90 minutes in a hyperbaric chamber, breathing 100% oxygen, but you're actively doing it with the bike version of it. Neurofeedback uses EEG technology to first get a map of the brain and see what's functioning and what's not functioning, find those areas of hypo or hyperactivity, and then treat it with a biofeedback loop system, essentially, on that neurofeedback. That can also help with anxiety issues, cognition issues, migraines, lots of different things that we see with post-concussive symptoms. PRTMS, that transcranial magnetic stimulation, has evolved over the years. It started with electric shock therapy, and now it's used to a magnet system. The PR is the personalized repetitive. So different companies have transformed that initial TMS to RTMS and now to PRTMS to really get that personalized nature and do an individualized treatment to help recover. It kind of uses similar-ish EEG technology than the biofeedback or the neurofeedback, to help the brain heal after a brain injury. It's currently FDA approved for a few uses. They're working on getting FDA approval for concussion. But the uses that there are right now is migraine, depression. I forget the third one off the top of my head, but things that we see with concussion patients anyway. And then the neurostimulator devices really help for autonomic nervous system dysfunction. The Dolphin NeuroStim is one that I've used. Apollo, I actually have on my wrist here today, just got it today, and the Pulsetto device. There are different settings on some of these. You can get in a professional setting versus a personal setting that you can get on your own. But again, very good for helping to calm down the nervous system and reset that nervous system that can be very much out of normal function after a concussion. Neurological chiropractic, that's where I got my Apollo device. They use a lot of the different technologies that we list here on this slide, and they are more of an outside-the-box thinking, but they're definitely in the neurotech world because they use a lot of technologies for vestibular therapy, for autonomic nervous system retraining, for vision retraining. There's a lot of technologies involved working with a neurological chiropractor. And the problem with all of these is that they typically tend to be out-of-pocket expenses. They tend to be very expensive because insurance just doesn't cover it. So that's the main thing that I shared at Washington, D.C., sharing that information and talking about what are the next steps? What are the things that I would like to see our policymakers doing? The next things that we're going to talk about are some of those things that they could actually have some benefit for. So what can all of our members out in Congress do for us? There currently is an act called the Traumatic Brain Injury, the TBI Act, that was started back in 1996. So President Bill Clinton was the first one to sign this. Multiple presidents have had their hands on it since that time. But at the time, it was the only legislation out there that specifically addressed TBI prevention, research, and service delivery through grants that they set out to the states. So the key federal agencies that we utilize as part of this TBI Act are the CDC, the NIH, and the ACL. ACL is the Administration for Community Living, if you haven't heard of that one. I had to look that one up initially when I learned about it because I was not as familiar with that one. But so what the CDC does as part of this is actually conduct that information and education sessions and the prevention activities and determine the incidence and prevalence of TBI in the United States. So they're looking at those numbers to see how are we doing with concussion and TBI? Where are we at with numbers? What's the incidence? What's the current prevalence? The NIH has been authorized to conduct research on TBI, including, again, prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and just general management. So they're conducting a lot of the research that then they are supposed to be sharing between these two organizations so that we can know exactly where we are with TBI and what we're doing for it. And then the ACL, that Administration for Community Living, that's where the grants come into play. So there are two grants that live under this act that improve access and advocacy in the states for traumatic brain injury. There are some core resources that we also see being utilized. From the CDC is the Heads Up Concussion Program. Many of you have probably heard of this if you have children in sports or if you were a child in sports at some point. There's a lot of education for the community. There's education for coaches on how to identify concussion and how to prevent it. So there's a lot of information in there on helmet use and everything. Just a lot of really good information on that CDC Heads Up Concussion program, as well as the TBI model systems and the TBI Model Systems Knowledge Translation Centers. If you follow me on socials, you saw that not that long ago I became an ambassador for the TBI Model Systems Translation Centers because I utilize a lot of their resources when I'm educating patients, when I'm preparing different data for my podcast, for my books that I've written. I've used their resources quite a lot. So then I became an ambassador for the program so that I can just tell other people of how great the resources are. But we can't continue having these kind of resources if we don't have the funding for it. So the act was initially written up back in 1996, approved by President Bill Clinton. There was an amendment in 2000 to add more services for children. And then it was reauthorized in 2008, in 2014, and in 2018. So it has to be reauthorized periodically because it's asking for funding at the federal level to support these grants that go out to the individual states. It was introduced for reauthorization back in 2025. Last year, March of 2025, I went out to the National TBI Day, the Brain Injury Day at the Capitol, and I was part of a group that we went and met with our legislators that day, not on a panel, but just meeting with the legislative offices of our respective states. There were, I forget how many of us were in attendance at that conference and then at the Capitol for the TBI Awareness Day. And our biggest thing was trying to get all of the legislators to support and sign and agree to reauthorize this TBI Act. Well, guess what? It didn't make the cut for the final approval to get it reauthorized. So it still has yet to be reauthorized. It's the Reauthorization Act of 2025, and we are now in 2026, and it has not been reauthorized. So there's a lot of question on what kind of supports are still going to be in place because the states use those grants to fund resource facilitation programs and other education and support programs in each state for individuals that have had a brain injury. So it's really, really important that we get that reauthorized and get the funding going and get the treatment necessary for patients that have individuals that have had a brain injury and they're living in the community with these and they need those community supports so that they continue to get the services that they need, which if we look at some of the different waiver programs, this is kind of getting off topic a little bit, but when we look at some of the waiver programs that each states might be able to offer, not all states have the waivers to support individuals. And what those waivers do is help individuals to live in the community rather than in long-term care facilities. And believe it or not, that actually saves the state money when they do that. And it allows the individual to be a little bit more independent than they were previously. Now, there are a couple other acts that have been introduced in Congress, and just wanted to kind of talk about those for just a brief moment. In 2023, an act was introduced called the Protecting Survivors from Traumatic Brain Injury Act. So this act was supposed to authorize the Secretary of Health and Human Services to collect data on domestic and sexual violence related TBI so that we can know how to protect individuals from that source of TBI. This act did not last very long. It died in Congress that year. In 2025, there was another act introduced, the Veterans National Traumatic Brain Injury Treatment Act. This one was meant to be a 5-year pilot program to furnish hyperbaric oxygen therapy to veterans that have traumatic brain injury or PTSD, probably both. So on this one, it has not died in Congress yet. It was introduced in 2025. It currently has 15 co-sponsors, which are bipartisan. There's Republicans and Democrats that are co-sponsoring this act. So that would be a wonderful thing if you want to look up this Veterans National TBI Treatment Act and see if your Congress people in your states are supporting this. Maybe write to them if they're not, if that's something that you wish to do. And in 2026, just this year in January, the Beacon Act was introduced. The Beacon Act is meant to have the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to award grants to prospective randomized controlled trials for neurorehabilitative treatments. There was another source that I saw that said it was supposed to be used for neurotechnology on the or acts.gov, that website that I was looking at, the official website. It doesn't say neurotechnology. So I think maybe some of those words got changed in translation as it was getting sourced out at different places. But that's what I would really love to see, is some of those neurotechnologies getting funded and identified so that we can potentially get approval at some point so that they're not going to be all out-of-pocket treatments. So this bill currently has 11 co-sponsors. Again, bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats are supporting this act. And I would love to see it become a real thing again at some point. Thinking along the lines of just general policy. So those are the only acts that I was able to find, by the way. There's not a lot out there that has been introduced. When we were at the Capitol, one of the other legislators said that they had been introduced a proposal for support for PTSD for veterans, and that would be amazing as well. So there's a lot. I just looked up specifically traumatic brain injury related acts, and that's all that I found. So that's what we've got so far here in the United States. Not a lot of action going on. So in January of 2025, so back up a year, the CMS, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, officially recognized TBI as a chronic condition. And this was huge. This was one of the big things we talked about when I was in DC last year in 2025. So we talked about the fact that CMS finally acknowledged that it was a chronic condition, because 20 years ago, when I was in my medical training initially, and we talked about how most people got better within 3 to 4 weeks, 21 to 28 days, and most people got better. It was a great thing to think of, and that was what I practiced for the longest time because that's what I was taught in school, and nobody ever told me differently. We know differently now. So as I had on my little slide there, since 2021, all of the research has been saying 30 to 50% of individuals continue to have symptoms well beyond a year. That's the data that I present to my patients all the time because it's out there. You can find it. There's lots of research to identify these numbers. It is a chronic condition. It is not a once and done. It is not that somebody hit their head and never had any repercussions. Does that happen for people? Yes. Is it the majority of cases? No, I don't consider 50% a majority at all. If it was 51% that get better, sure, we'll go with that whole political 51% majority, but it is not a 51% majority. 30 to 50% of patients continue to have symptoms well beyond a year. So it is a chronic condition. So this is where I get into my little global speech. So in 2024, the G4 Alliance TBI working group was formed. This is a global working group, a global coalition that's working toward formally recognizing TBI as a chronic notifiable condition at the World Health Organization level. Big. This is bigger than the United States. So I said at the beginning, I would love to see what policies are happening in other countries. I'm getting a glimpse of that. Every three weeks, I attend these virtual meetings with this global coalition and get to hear what's happening in all of these other countries and how we're getting people involved and finding out how big of an impact this has across the globe. TBI is not something that chooses a gender or a race or a religion to attack. Anyone at any time, any age, any race, any gender, any sexuality, nationality, anything can have a brain injury. And any one of those brain injuries can become a chronic condition at any given time. And we don't know who's going to be who. Are there risk factors that say that you might be one of those people that becomes chronic? Sure. But I've had patients with and without those risk factors, both getting better just fine and having chronic conditions. So just having the risk factors doesn't mean you're going to have it. Doesn't mean you're not going to have it if you don't have them. So it is a chronic condition, and trying to get this at a global level really to identify how big of a problem we have across the globe. This is so phenomenal that I am meeting with people from Turkey, Pakistan. I can't even remember all the countries that are on this call when we do this. There are so many of them on there. the African countries, Canada. Literally, I cannot think of all of them. There are so many countries involved on this phone call, but we can always use more help and more support for this. So the goal is to improve global surveillance care and funding. It was intended to be on the agenda for the World Health Assembly 79, WHA 79, that's happening this year, May of 2026. But the application just missed the cutoff date to get on the agenda. So the new goal is to be on the agenda for next year. That said, we are currently trying to work on getting support from the heads of state of as many countries as possible across the globe to support this and sponsor this effort and agree that, yes, this is something that we need to address on a global scale. So there is an event on May 17th in Geneva, Switzerland, a side event from the WHA 79. I will post a link. I've been invited to go speak, and I'm super excited to do this. I will post a link in the show notes so that you can try to register. If by chance you live near Geneva and you can be there personally, that would be great. If not, there is a virtual option. So you can virtually attend and listen to all the speeches. There's going to be speakers from the coalition. There's going to be speakers that are persons with lived experience. And we're hoping to have speakers of some of those heads of state as well to talk about policy on that global level. So it should be a really fascinating meeting. I'm excited to be a part of that and really excited to share this kind of policy stuff with you. Years and years ago, I was really into politics, and I've really been very much out of politics for a long time because I'm not happy with the political situation in the world, really, not just our country, but there's a lot of politics going on that are very unpleasant. And this is one area where I feel like I can actually make a difference. So if you are just as passionate about that as I am, I would love to have you join the efforts as well. So like I said, I'll put that link in the show notes so you can find out more information about the Global Coalition if you're interested. If you feel so inclined to do so, reach out to your local legislators and encourage them to support these acts that have been proposed and support the reauthorization of the TBI Act so that we can get funding going. I'd love to see money spent on this rather than other things that we're spending money on, at least in our nation right now. So thank you guys for listening. It's been a fun little half hour here. So hope to see you in the next show. Again, if you have further comments, I would love to hear it. If you have other ideas for show topics, people I should interview on the show, let me know. Send me a message, leave a message on the notes on the show, comment, do all the things, and hope to see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it so that others can benefit. Please also consider supporting the show by buying me a coffee. The link is in the show notes. You can also go to www.brainwellnesssolutions.com to catch the latest info and get links on all of the social medias there. See you next time.